Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. Well, this is the final episode of the M3 Lee build, and this is episode 6. We're going to paint a figure, we're going to finish up the base, and we're going to put everything all together for a final presentation. So let's get started. Well, let's get started with the figures, and this figure kit is from Warriors. Well, interestingly enough, coincidentally, it happens to be British tankers in Burma. What a nice surprise. I began painting the figure using an airbrush, painting it first black, and then from the top, using that zenithal light idea, painting the white highlights from above. It's also a fairly effective technique for painting my thumb and fingers. This should provide me with a pretty nice roadmap on the shadows and highlights as I go through and start adding color. I then lay down the flesh tones in my palette, and one of the lessons I learned when working with the Panzer II figures is that I'm more comfortable beginning with a mid-tone rather than, say, a dark tone and working up from there. So that's what I'm doing now, is just laying down a light flesh tone, mid-tone to this figure. And I'm doing it in almost a dry brush fashion because what I really want to do is I want to maintain those shadows and highlights that I was able to get through the use of the airbrush. Next, I'll begin adding highlights and shadows, and first I'll begin with some highlights just by adding a little bit lighter shade to the paint mix and just applying that in some of the more obvious areas where the sun might catch the figure's face. Well, I have a few highlights established, and for me, I like to add some shadows at this point because for me, it just works better if I can see the contrast between the highlights and the shadows come together at the same time. So I'll be going back and forth, adding highlights, adding shadows, adding highlights, adding shadows. And for the shadows, of course, you just place those in all the recessed areas. The deepest recessed areas is where I begin, and that would be around the eyes, under the nose, under the lips, around the lips. And then as you can see, just come right back in with a little bit of highlight and start reestablishing. And this process is the tried and true, which is start with a little bit larger field of say a mid-tone color and refine that and get brighter and brighter in a smaller and smaller point of light. Of course, I'm using acrylic colors for this figure, and one of the challenges using acrylics, and especially a challenge for me, is blending. And that's, taking those areas where you have your highlights and you have your shadows, and you want to be able to make smooth transitions between the two fields of color. And in terms of blending, first thing is that the paints that I'm using for these blends are very translucent, so they've been highly watered down. And the second is, it's not so much about painting on the figure, it's the stippling motion, and dabbing is really a more effective way of adding color in a little bit more random manner, I guess it is, so that the blends become a lot more smooth and natural looking. I'll continue to work on these flesh tones for a little while and do a little bit more back and forth and start bringing out some more of the finer details. Well, the skin tones are coming along fairly well, I believe, and so now let's go ahead and move on to the uniform. And this is exactly the same process as I did with the face and the skin tones. I already have that mapping done of the highlights and the shadows from the airbrush. And now I'm just going ahead and added a little bit of light color. And for whatever reason, I started with a lighter color rather than the mid-tone color, but that will be fine. And I'll just continue to refine these details, adding shadows and highlights and adjusting the colors as I go along. You probably have noticed by now that there's actually green paints added to my palette in the background there. And that's because, well, I began this project, or began this figure, thinking that his uniform would be more of a brown khaki tone, but the further I got along with it, the more I was just second guessing myself and decided to make it more of a green colored uniform. And so slowly but surely, I'm just kind of changing those color tints. Well, as kind of a funny aside, I'm watching this video back as I'm making these comments, and as I'm looking at this video and watching the painting process kind of being a little bit separated from the actual moment, I'm struck by how relaxing this whole process looks to me, because I'm still figure painting challenge. Anyway, I have to think about this as I'm doing it, and so it's not necessarily a relaxing process, at least at this stage of my development. But with that said, it's probably just because of the challenge of learning a new skill that I'm really drawn towards figure painting. And like I've said before, figures really do make a scene, and as you have seen in my other projects, I do enjoy making the bases, and the figures just add so much to them. So to be able to try to combine the figures, the base, and the models together and really make a nice story, well, that's really the best part about model building in my estimation. In the end, I've got a figure that's at this point about, 85, 90% complete. And I'll go back and do a few extra little tweaks here and there, a few highlights and such, and just kind of tighten them up just a little bit more. But now it's time to put this entire scene together and get this model onto its base. You might have thought we finished up the diorama base in the last episode, but there's still a few things we need to work on here. I mentioned in the last episode that when working on our diorama bases, it's always a great idea to treat them like you would your model. Go back and look for those areas where you can add a little bit of highlight or extra color or detail. And that's exactly what I'm doing now for this diorama base. So like on those rocks, I've added just a little bit of extra color just to bring out a little bit of highlights on those top edges. I've added a little bit of extra color on some of those tropical plants in the foreground. And now I've got some natural moss that I've picked from the local area around here and preserved. And I'll just plant a few of these here and there. And that will just bring a little bit more color and texture to this wooded area. This is oil paints. I'm using oil paints here just to add a little bit of extra contrast and color tones. This is the same colors of oils that I've used already on the model and on the base. And I'm just making sure everything is tied together. Well, the almost final step on this project is going to be the addition of some pigments, and this is the first time I've used pigments on this entire project. Well, I've done a little bit of experimenting on the side, and I've chosen these colors because as they're blended together, I get a tone that's very similar to both the oil colors that I've used on the model and the base, and the pencil colors that I've used on the models. And then in my conversations with you before, when I've talked about pigments, you know that my preferred method of using pigments is when they're moist or dissolved in odorless thinner, and that's what I've done here in this little cup. And now I have this really nice color wash that I can use both on the model and on the base. Well, I'll return back to the road here and add some of this wash onto these areas. And you can see that I'm adding these colors or this wash in a linear pattern, so that will mimic the flow of traffic, give it a little sense of direction on this road. You might also see that this wash is actually very, very thin, so the amount of color that's being added is not dramatic, but it does make a difference. And then this same light wash is added to the lower areas of the model itself, and now we've got everything tied together between the road and the model. And now the very, very final thing we have to do is simply place our model onto the base. And with that, the Lee project is complete. Well, this has been a fun project for me, and I certainly hope that you folks have enjoyed it as well and maybe found something that's useful or at least entertaining along the way. If you do like this channel and like to support it, please hit that like and subscribe. It does help me get this channel out to more folks. There is also a bell at the bottom you can hit, which notifies you of new videos when they're released, which is generally every Tuesday. And then if you really, really like this channel, would like to support it further, I do have a Patreon page. The link for that is in the description below. As a thank you of being a Patreon member, I do release these videos to my members a little bit early, so they get early viewing before the public. I do also make some special short features on techniques or ideas that I'll post to the Patreon. Photographs of the ongoing projects, discussions on upcoming projects, and the message board is always open for chats and questions. So now it's on to the next project. Until next time, happy modeling. Thank you very much.